The year is 1140, a time of knights, castles, and a world shaped by ancient laws. But what if we told you that, in this era, simply being born a woman could mean your entire life path was legally predetermined in ways that would shock you today? How much control did a woman truly have over her own destiny, her property, her very body? And could she even speak for herself in a court of law? Number 10. Control over her own body and reproduction. Imagine living in a world where your very existence, your physical self, was not entirely your own. For women in 1140, this was often the stark reality, especially once they entered the institution of marriage. While today we champion individual autonomy and bodily rights as fundamental, the legal and social structures of the 12th century saw things through a very different lens. A woman's body within the confines of matrimony was, in many significant ways, legally seen as belonging to her husband, particularly regarding reproduction. This was not a minor point. It was a foundational pillar of society, deeply intertwined with notions of lineage, property, and religious duty. Primary purpose of marriage in the eyes of both the church and the secular law was the procreation of legitimate heirs. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a legal expectation and often a religious imperative. For a woman, this meant that refusal to engage in sexual relations within her marriage could be considered a serious dereliction of her wifely duties, potentially even grounds for an annulment or a legal dispute. It sounds incredible to our modern ears, doesn't it? The idea that a spouse could have a legal claim to your body in such an intimate way. Yet historical records and legal treatises from the period make it clear that a husband had a right to what was often termed conjugal debt. This wasn't just about personal desire, it was about the very continuation of the family line, the security of property, and the inheritance of titles. Consider the young Lady Eleanor, perhaps just 15 years old, married to a lord twice her age for political alliance or the consolidation of lands. From the moment the vows were exchanged, her personal wishes regarding procreation became secondary to the needs of the marital union and the lineage she had married into. She was expected to bear children, preferably sons, as quickly and as frequently as possible. Pregnancy, each birth, carried immense risks in a time without modern medicine. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. Yet the legal framework offered little respite or protection from the incessant demand for heirs. A woman's health, her physical toll, her personal comfort, these were often overlooked in favor of the greater dynastic purpose. There was no concept of spacing births for a woman's health, nor any legal way for her to refuse conjugal relations without risking her standing, her reputation, and even her legal rights within the marriage. Furthermore, within this era, the concept of marital rape as a crime simply did not exist in the legal sense we understand today. The legal and social understanding was that a husband had a right to sexual relations with his wife, and consent within marriage was largely assumed and not a point of legal contention. A wife's refusal was considered a breach of her duty, not a denial of her bodily autonomy. This created an incredibly vulnerable position for women, placing them at the mercy of their husbands without any legal recourse or protection for their physical person if a husband chose to exercise his perceived rights forcefully. Imagine the fear, the lack of agency, for a woman who felt she had no legitimate ground to refuse her husband, even if she was ill, exhausted, or simply unwilling. Personal desire or comfort was secondary to the husband's legal entitlement and the societal expectation of procreation. Beyond the specific act of procreation, women often had limited control over decisions relating to their own health and medical care, especially if those decisions were deemed to impact their fertility or their ability to bear children. While some women, particularly in the lower classes, might have had more practical autonomy in their daily lives, for those within formal legal structures, the husband often held the ultimate authority concerning his wife's well-being. A wife could not, for instance, undertake a prolonged pilgrimage or commit to a religious vow of chastity without her husband's explicit permission, as such actions might interfere with her marital duties, including her reproductive obligations. Her body, her physical presence, was understood as a resource for the family and for the husband, rather than a domain over which she had absolute sovereignty. Even in matters of dress, appearance, and public behavior, while not strictly bodily control in the reproductive sense, there were strong societal expectations and legal implications. A woman was expected to dress modestly, to behave in a way that upheld her husband's honor and the family's reputation. Transgressions like dressing provocatively or engaging in behavior deemed unchaste could reflect poorly on her husband and potentially lead to accusations that could jeopardize her legal standing or even lead to accusations of adultery, a grave offense for women with severe consequences. While men also faced social scrutiny, the onus on women to maintain their reputation through their physical presentation and conduct was often more intense and directly tied to their legal and social worth. The sum of these legal and social norms created a pervasive environment where a woman's body was not entirely her own. It was a vessel for lineage, a source of heirs, and a symbol of her husband's honor. Individual desires, her physical comfort, her personal autonomy regarding her own person, were frequently subordinated to these larger societal and familial demands. This fundamental lack of legal control over her own body meant that a woman in 1140 often lived with a profound sense of vulnerability, her physical self inextricably tied to the duties and expectations placed upon her by a patriarchal legal system. It's a stark reminder of how far the concept of individual rights has evolved, and how differently personal liberty was understood in the distant past. Number 9. Professional life in guilds. If you were a young woman in 1140, looking to forge your own path, perhaps dreaming of becoming a skilled artisan or a merchant, you would quickly encounter a formidable legal and social barrier: the guild system. Guilds were the powerful professional organizations of the medieval world, controlling access to trades, setting standards, and regulating markets. For women, gaining independent entry into these exclusive clubs was, more often than not, a nearly impossible feat. This meant that a woman's economic independence and her ability to pursue a profession were severely restricted, placing her in a position of legal subordination within the economic sphere. Medieval society, while certainly needing the labor of women, especially in agriculture and domestic industries, largely viewed women's roles as supportive rather than independently professional. The most common profession for a woman was that of a wife, managing the household, raising children, and assisting her husband in his trade or craft. While this often meant a woman was incredibly skilled and hardworking, her contributions were rarely recognized as independent professional work in the same way a man's was. She was an assistant, a partner, but not usually the master. This distinction had significant legal implications for her earnings, her property rights, and her ability to engage in independent business ventures. Consider the legal framework of guilds. These organizations were designed to protect the interests of their members, often male heads of households. To become a master craftsman, one typically had to undergo a lengthy apprenticeship, often for 7 years or more, followed by a period as a journeyman, and then finally produce a masterpiece to prove one's skill. This entire structure was built around the male life trajectory. For a young woman, the very idea of embarking on such an apprenticeship was fraught with difficulties. Who would take her on? Would she be allowed to live away from her family? And how would her potential marriage affect her commitment to the craft? Legal statutes of many guilds either explicitly forbade women from membership or simply did not cater for their entry, leaving them outside the formal economic structures that offered advancement and protection. Imagine Agnes, a bright and industrious young woman in a thriving medieval town. Her father is a successful baker, a member of the powerful Bakers' Guild. Agnes spends her childhood learning every aspect of the trade, from kneading dough to managing the ovens, from calculating costs to dealing with customers. She is arguably as skilled, if not more so, than many of the male apprentices her father takes on. Yet, when it comes time for Agnes to consider her future, the path to becoming an independent master baker is largely closed off to her. She cannot formally join the guild, she cannot train as an apprentice in the same way as a boy, and she certainly cannot legally set up her own bakery without her husband's name on the deed if she marries. Her skill, her knowledge, her labor, while indispensable to the family business, do not grant her the independent legal standing that a man would enjoy. There were, of course, exceptions, but these often proved the rule. Widows of master craftsmen were sometimes allowed to continue their deceased husband's trade, but this was usually a temporary measure, and often contingent on their ability to maintain the business and, crucially, to pay the guild fees and abide by its rule. This allowance was more about preserving the continuity of the family business and supporting the widow, rather than granting her independent professional status. Even then, her activities might be restricted. She might not be allowed to take on apprentices or hold the same administrative roles within the guild as a male master. She was often seen as merely keeping the seat warm until a male heir could take over, or until she remarried. Think of Martha, a widow whose husband, a skilled weaver, has passed away suddenly. Martha had worked alongside him for decades, knowing every thread and every loom. The Weavers' Guild might permit her to continue operating the workshop, ensuring that the loom, a valuable asset, remains productive and that the family has income. But her right to do so is derived from her deceased husband's status, not her own. Should she remarry, her new husband would typically assume legal control of the workshop and her business activities, potentially subsuming her independent operation entirely. Professional life, even as a widow, was legally contingent on her marital status and her relationship to a man. Beyond the formal guild structures, other forms of professional life were also heavily gendered and legally constrained. While women were vital in agriculture, domestic service, brewing, and some forms of retail, these were often less formal and offered fewer opportunities for significant wealth accumulation or independent legal standing. A woman could sell eggs in the market, but owning the land that produced them or the cart that transported them might be legally complex if she were married. Earnings, even if she generated them, were often legally her husband's property, further limiting her financial independence. In essence, the legal subordination of women in professional life meant that their talents, their labor, and their potential for independent economic contribution were channeled into specific, often subordinate, roles. It prevented them from accumulating personal wealth, from holding formal power within significant economic institutions, and from charting their own independent professional courses. This was not merely a social custom. It was embedded in the legal recognition, or lack thereof, of women as independent economic actors, effectively limiting their ambition and opportunities in a world structured by male-dominated professional hierarchies. Number 8, protection from violence and abuse. It is a deeply uncomfortable truth, but for women in 1140, the legal framework offered distressingly little protection from violence, particularly within the sanctity of the home. In an era where patriarchal norms were not just social customs, but often embedded in law, a husband's legal dominion over his wife was a widely accepted concept. This meant that the line between discipline and abuse was blurry, and legal recourse for a woman experiencing violence at the hands of her husband was virtually non-existent, leaving her in a profoundly vulnerable position. The concept of a husband's authority over his wife was rooted in various sources. Church teachings, which emphasized the husband as the head of the household, Roman legal traditions that influenced European law, and long-standing Germanic customs. These influences coalesced into a legal understanding where a husband had the right, and sometimes even the perceived duty, to correct his wife. This correction could include physical chastisement. While extreme violence was generally frowned upon by the church and public opinion, moderate physical discipline was often considered a husband's prerogative, a means to maintain order within the household and ensure his wife's obedience. It's a shocking thought for us today, but in the 12th century, the idea that a husband could physically strike his wife to enforce his will was not an illegal act in itself, provided it did not lead to permanent injury or death. Consider the hypothetical plight of Lady Isabella, married to a baron known for his quick temper. The baron, in a fit of rage over a perceived disobedience or a domestic dispute, were to strike Isabella, she would have almost no legal recourse. She could not easily go to a court and accuse him of assault in the way a man might accuse another man. The legal system was not designed to intervene in what was largely considered a private, domestic matter. Any bruises she bore would likely be seen as a legitimate consequence of a husband's right to correct his wife, rather than a criminal offense. Pleas would likely fall on deaf ears, or she might be advised to simply endure her husband's temperament, perhaps seek spiritual guidance, but not legal justice. Even if the violence escalated to a more severe level, short of murder, a woman's ability to find protection was severely limited. There were no women's shelters, no hotlines, no established legal procedures for obtaining restraining order. Family might intervene, especially if she came from a powerful background, but such intervention would be social pressure, not a formal legal process. For a woman from a less influential family, or one far from her kin, her options were even more dismal. She was essentially trapped within her marriage, legally bound to her husband, with very few avenues for escape or protection from his violence. What about legal separation or annulment based on cruelty? While the church did have jurisdiction over marriage and could grant separations or annulments, the grounds for these were extremely narrow and heavily favored men. A wife could potentially seek a separation if her husband was committing egregious acts, such as persistent adultery, especially if it involved another woman bringing shame to the household or attempts on her life, but ordinary physical abuse, if it did not threaten her life or cause severe disfigurement, was unlikely to be considered sufficient grounds. Furthermore, even if a separation was granted, it did not dissolve the marriage entirely and often left the woman in an economically precarious position, as her dower rights might be jeopardized, and she would likely be reliant on her family for support. The very concept of marital rape, as mentioned earlier, simply did not exist in legal terms. A husband's right to conjugal relations was enshrined in law and custom. This meant that a wife could not legally accuse her husband of sexual assault, even if the act was forced or against her will. The legal framework offered no protection for her bodily autonomy within marriage, leaving her without recourse for what we would today recognize as a serious crime. This lack of legal recognition for consent within marriage created a deeply coercive environment for women. Moreover, if a woman were to physically defend herself against her husband's violence, her actions could be construed as insubordination or even assault on her part, potentially leading to further punishment or legal troubles. The law generally upheld the husband's authority, meaning that any act that undermined it, even in self-defense, could be viewed unfavorably. The balance of legal power was so overwhelmingly tilted towards the husband that a woman was often left with no option but passive endurance. This systemic lack of legal protection had profound psychological and physical consequences for women. It fostered an environment of fear, suppressed their voices, and ensured that domestic violence remained largely invisible to the formal justice system, deemed a private matter within the family unit. The legal codes of 1140, rather than protecting women from harm within their own homes, often inadvertently sanctioned forms of physical coercion, making it a legal reality that a woman's body was not fully her own, and her safety within marriage was far from guaranteed by the law. It's a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained patriarchal power was in the very fabric of medieval law and society. Number 7, political power and leadership. Imagine a kingdom where the crown sits firmly on the head of a king, where councils are filled with men, and where decisions of war and peace are made exclusively by male voices. This was the landscape of political power in 1140, a world where women were, almost without exception, legally excluded from holding direct political office or wielding significant public authority. While there were extraordinary exceptions, usually involving queens acting as regents, these were often temporary, conditional, and still operated within a framework that privileged male rule. The legal and customary norms of the era ensured that a woman's participation in the highest echelons of power was virtually non-existent, marking a clear legal subordination. The fundamental principle of primogeniture, which dictated that inheritance of titles, lands, and power passed to the eldest male heir, was the cornerstone of this exclusion. Kingship, dukedoms, earldoms, baronies, these were almost exclusively male domains. Daughter, even if she was the eldest child, would typically be bypassed in favor of a younger brother, a distant male cousin, or even a more remote male relative, simply because of her gender. This was not merely a social preference, it was a legally enshrined principle in most European monarchies and feudal lordships. The idea of a woman ruling in her own right, holding sovereign power directly, was seen as unnatural, against divine order, and potentially dangerous to the stability of the realm. Consider the powerful example of succession. The king died without a surviving son. His daughter, no matter how capable or intelligent, would likely not inherit the throne directly. Instead, her husband would be crowned king, or a male relative would be brought in, or the throne would be contested by various male claimants. The claim, if any, was usually through her husband, serving to legitimate his rule, rather than giving her personal authority. For instance, Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England, was designated his heir, but after his death, her cousin Stephen seized the throne, leading to a long civil war. Even when she came close to securing the crown, she was always battling against the inherent reluctance of the male-dominated aristocracy to accept a female ruler. Her son, Henry, eventually became king, not she. Her authority was derived from her male lineage and aimed at establishing a male successor, not her own independent reign. Even for queens who were married to kings, their power was largely indirect and advisory. Queen consort might exert influence through her husband. She might hold her own dower lands and manage her household. She might even serve as a patron of arts or charities, but she rarely had a direct say in matters of state, lawmaking, or military command. Her legal standing was that of a wife to the king, not a co-ruler. She was legally subordinate to her husband, the monarch, even if her personality or intelligence commanded respect. The most prominent exception to this rule was the queen regent. When a king died leaving a young, underage son as heir, his mother might be appointed as regent, ruling on behalf of her son until he came of age. This role, while powerful, was inherently temporary and conditional. Her authority was derived from her son, not from her own right to rule. She was a placeholder, a guardian of the throne for a future male ruler. Even then, her regency was often viewed with suspicion, and she would typically be surrounded by a council of powerful male nobles whose advice she would be expected to heed. They often held the real power, limiting her independent decision-making. Should her son come of age, or should a suitable male relative be found to take over, her regency would end, and she would recede from direct political power. Imagine a queen like Adela of Blois, daughter of William the Conqueror, who effectively managed her husband's vast estates and later served as regent for her sons. She was undoubtedly a shrewd and capable woman. Yet her immense practical power was always framed within her role as wife and mother to male heirs. She could not legally convene a council, issue royal decrees in her own name, or lead an army without her husband's or son's authority, even if she was the one truly running affairs. Her leadership was a testament to her personal strength and intellect, but it did not alter the fundamental legal structures that denied women independent political power. Below the level of royalty, the situation was even starker. Women were entirely excluded from positions of formal political authority, such as serving as judges, sheriffs, royal officials, or members of feudal courts. These were exclusively male roles, requiring oaths of fealty and demonstrating military prowess, neither of which were seen as appropriate or legally permissible for women. A woman could not sit in judgment over men, nor could she lead troops in battle. Her voice, if heard in political matters at all, was always through a male intermediary, her father, husband, or son. This legal exclusion from political power meant that women had no direct say in the laws that governed their lives, the taxes they paid, or the wars that affected their families. They were subjects, but not citizens with the same legal rights to participate in governance. The legal framework of 1140 was built upon the premise that political leadership was a male domain, a reflection of the prevailing belief that men were inherently more rational, capable, and divinely ordained to rule. This pervasive legal subordination in the political sphere left women without a voice in the very structures that shaped their entire society. Number 6. Legal standing and testimony. Imagine being in a court of law, facing a grave injustice, but discovering that your voice, your testimony, holds less weight, less credibility than that of a man. This was often the stark reality for women in 1140. In a legal system built upon male authority and male-centric interpretations of justice, a woman's ability to bring a lawsuit, to testify effectively, or even to defend herself in court was significantly constrained, placing her in a position of distinct legal subordination. Her legal standing was, in many ways, an extension of her male guardian or husband. The core of this legal disparity was the concept of coverture, a legal doctrine common in many parts of medieval Europe. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband. They became, in legal terms, one person, and that person was the husband. This meant a married woman could not generally sue or be sued independently in a court of law. Any legal action involving her or her interests had to be brought by or against her husband on her behalf. Her legal persona, her ability to act independently in the eyes of the law, essentially disappeared upon marriage. Consider the scenario of a woman, let's call her Elara, whose dower lands, the lands she was entitled to for her support after her husband's death, are encroached upon by a neighboring lord. If Elara is married, she cannot simply march into court and file a complaint. Her husband, Lord Reginald, would have to initiate the legal action on her behalf. He would be the one to present the case, argue before the judge, and legally represent her interests. While Reginald might act in good faith, his primary loyalty was to his own interests and the family's overall position. What if he felt the fight was too costly, or he had a different agreement with the neighboring lord? Ilara would have little to no legal say in the matter, despite it directly concerning her property and future well-being. Her legal voice was silenced, mediated through her husband. Even if a woman was single or a widow, and thus possessed a greater degree of independent legal standing, her testimony in court might still be regarded with suspicion or require corroboration in ways a man's would not. Medieval legal systems, heavily influenced by Roman and canon law, often viewed women as more emotional, less rational, and therefore less reliable as witnesses. This bias was sometimes explicit in legal texts, suggesting that a woman's word alone was not as strong as a man's, especially in serious criminal cases or those involving accusations against men. Imagine a violent dispute breaking out in a village, and the only direct witness is a woman, perhaps a spinner working by her cottage window. When the local reeve or lord's bailiff investigates, her account, while valuable, might be cross-referenced with additional male witnesses, or simply given less weight if a man's testimony contradicted hers. In matters of accusation, particularly those involving sexual crimes, a woman's testimony was notoriously difficult to prove. Accusations of rape, for instance, were exceedingly rare to win, often requiring immediate outcry, physical evidence, and male corroboration, placing an impossible burden of proof on the victim. The legal system inherently doubted the credibility of women, making it arduous for them to seek justice when they were the wronged party. Furthermore, a woman's ability to defend herself in court was also hampered. She could not typically engage in judicial duels, which were a common form of trial by combat to prove innocence or guilt in many disputes. This option was reserved for men. If a woman was accused of a crime, she would have to rely on a male champion to fight for her, or perhaps be subject to trial by ordeal, a process that was brutal and often deadly. This meant her legal defense was not within her own hands, but literally in the hands of another. This legal vulnerability extended to signing contracts or entering into agreements. While a single woman or a widow might have some capacity, a married woman almost always required her husband's consent and signature for any significant legal transaction. If she tried to act independently, the contract could be deemed invalid, further undermining her economic and legal agency. This prevented married women from engaging in independent business ventures, incurring debts, or disposing of property without their husband's express permission, solidifying his control over her financial and legal affairs. The legal subordination of women in terms of their standing and testimony was a pervasive force, touching every aspect of their lives. It meant that in the very arena designed to uphold justice, women found their voices muted, their credibility questioned, and their autonomy diminished. The law in 1140 was a male-dominated instrument, largely crafted by men, interpreted by men, and primarily serving the interests and structures of a male-dominated society, leaving women with a precarious and subordinate legal position. Number 5. Divorce and annulment rights. Imagine being trapped in a marriage that has become unbearable, perhaps abusive, or simply loveless, but having virtually no legal means to escape it. For women in 1140, this was often the reality of divorce and annulment. While today we understand marriage as a civil contract that can be dissolved, medieval society, guided by the powerful hand of the church, viewed marriage as a sacred, indissoluble sacrament. This made legal separation incredibly difficult for anyone, but the grounds and procedures were far more restrictive and disadvantageous for women, reinforcing their legal subordination within marital bonds. The Catholic Church held almost absolute jurisdiction over marriage. Divorce, in the modern sense of dissolving a valid marriage, was not permissible. What was possible were annulments, which declared that a marriage had never been valid in the first place, or separations a mensa et thoro, from bed and board, which allowed spouses to live apart but remained legally married, unable to remarry. Key here is that initiating either of these processes was a monumental undertaking, fraught with legal complexities, social stigma, and disproportionate challenges for women. For a woman to seek an annulment, she would have to prove that the marriage was invalid from its inception due to pre-existing conditions. These conditions were very specific and limited. Consanguinity, too close a blood relation, often used by powerful families to escape unwanted alliances. Pre-contract with another party, impotence, usually on the part of the husband, as it prevented procreation, or lack of genuine consent under duress. proving any of these was incredibly difficult. Take, for example, the issue of non-consummation due to the husband's impotence. This might sound like a clear-cut case, but medieval courts often required inspection of the parties, which was humiliating for both, and the woman might still be blamed if the issue was not immediately apparent. Furthermore, the husband could simply claim it was a temporary condition, or that his wife was simply unwilling, placing the burden of proof squarely on her. Even more challenging were separations. A separation mensa et thoro allowed spouses to live apart, but it did not allow either party to remarry. Grounds for separation typically included adultery, severe cruelty, heresy, or persistent desertion. However, the application of these grounds was often gender-biased. A husband's adultery, while technically a sin, was often viewed less severely than a wife's. A wife's adultery was a grave offense, threatening the legitimacy of heirs and the husband's honor, and could easily lead to her being disinherited or cast out. A husband's adultery, on the other hand, while condemned, rarely granted his wife immediate or easy legal recourse for separation, unless it was public, scandalous, and brought extreme dishonor upon the household. Imagine the plight of Lady Alex, whose husband, a knight, has taken a mistress openly, parading her and her illegitimate children around their estate. While this is morally reprehensible by church standards, for Alex to obtain a separation, she would need substantial proof, witnesses, and would have to navigate a legal system largely sympathetic to male authority. Even if she succeeded, she would remain legally married to him, unable to ever remarry, potentially condemning her to a lonely and economically precarious existence. Meanwhile, her husband could continue his illicit relationship with little legal consequence, beyond perhaps a penance from the church. Cruelty was another potential ground, but as discussed in the previous chapter, the definition of cruelty was narrow and often did not include the forms of domestic violence that were legally permitted under a husband's right to discipline. For a woman to successfully argue cruelty, it would usually have to involve life-threatening assaults, severe disfigurement, or public humiliation. Normal physical abuse, even if frequent, was often dismissed as a private matter or part of marital discipline. This meant that women enduring regular physical abuse often had no legal avenue for separation. Economic implications of seeking separation were also profoundly disadvantageous for women. If a woman initiated the process, she risked losing her dower rights, her access to her husband's property, and her financial support. She might be forced to return to her family, becoming a burden. A husband, however, might have more leverage to force a separation, potentially keeping the property and simply shedding an unwanted wife, leaving her destitute. The legal system did not provide for spousal support or equitable division of assets in the way modern divorce laws do. A woman's economic survival was inextricably linked to her marriage. Furthermore, public opinion and social stigma played a huge role. For a woman to bring such a suit was highly scandalous, tainting her reputation and making her an object of gossip and suspicion. For a man, it might be viewed differently, perhaps even as a justifiable response to a wayward wife. Double standard was deeply ingrained in the legal and social norms. In essence, the legal framework surrounding marriage in 1140 was designed to be almost unbreakable, and where cracks existed, they were far easier for men to exploit or to their advantage. Women faced immense legal and social hurdles to escape an unhappy or unsafe marriage, rendering them legally bound to their husbands, often without real agency or hope of recourse. This lack of divorce or effective annulment rights was a profound manifestation of women's legal subordination, chaining them to a marital status that often served the interests of lineage and property far more than it served individual happiness or safety. Number 4, guardianship of children. Imagine having children, nurturing them, raising them, but having little to no legal say in their future should their father die, or if there is a dispute over their upbringing. This was the legally subordinate position of women in 1140 concerning the guardianship of their own children, particularly if those children were male heirs to property or titles. While a mother's emotional bond and practical care for her children were recognized, her legal authority over them, especially after her husband's death, was significantly diminished compared to male relatives. In the feudal system of 1140, the concept of guardianship was inextricably linked to property and inheritance. When a father, especially a lord or landowner, died, the guardianship of his underage children, and crucially, the management of their lands and revenues, typically passed to a male relative or to the overlord, not automatically to the widowed mother. This was because the legal system was designed to protect the integrity of the feudal holding, the inheritance, and the lineage, which were overwhelmingly male-centric. The mother, despite being the direct parent, was often viewed as less capable of managing the complex legal and military obligations that came with feudal land tenure. Consider the example of Lady Philippa, a grieving widow whose husband, a baron, has just died, leaving behind a young son, William, as his heir. While Philippa has raised William since birth and knows his character and needs better than anyone, the law dictates that his guardianship, and therefore the control of the barony, will likely pass to her late husband's eldest surviving brother, or perhaps to the immediate feudal overlord, such as the king or a duke. This guardian would manage the lands, collect revenues, and potentially even arrange the child's future marriage, all without Philippa's legal consent or input. She might be allowed to continue living with her son, but her role would be one of emotional support, not legal authority. She would have to petition, perhaps even bribe, to gain any significant influence over her son's upbringing, let alone the management of his inheritance. The rationale behind this legal setup was multi-layered. Firstly, it was believed that women, due to their perceived emotional nature and lack of military experience, were unsuitable for the responsibilities of feudal lordship, which included military service, managing vassals, and administering justice. These were deemed masculine tasks. Secondly, there was a concern that a widowed mother might remarry, and her new husband could potentially divert the inheritance or influence the heir in a way that was detrimental to the original lineage. The law sought to prevent this by placing the guardianship in the hands of a male relative who theoretically had a vested interest in the original family line, or a feudal overlord who had a direct stake in the proper management of the fief. Even in cases where a mother was granted guardianship of her children, it was often a conditional arrangement, particularly if the children were not heirs to major landholdings, or if no suitable male guardian was available. She would likely be overseen by a male counsel, or her authority would be subject to strict limitations. For instance, she might be responsible for the children's daily care, but not for their education, especially if it involved nightly training for sons or their marriage arrangements, which were crucial for securing alliances and consolidating family power. These decisions, profoundly impactful on a child's life, would often rest with male relatives or the feudal overlord. Imagine a situation where a widowed mother, Margaret, finds herself with a young daughter, perhaps the only heir to a small estate. While she might be permitted to manage the estate and her daughter's upbringing, she would still face pressure to marry her daughter advantageously, often dictated by male relatives or the local lord. If she herself remarried, her new husband would gain control of her daughter's inheritance, and her legal authority over her own child would once again be subsumed by her new husband's dominion. The very act of marriage often meant a woman relinquished her independent legal standing, including her ability to act as the primary legal guardian for her own offspring. This legal framework ensured that the lineage, property, and strategic alliances of families remained under male control, even in the absence of a male parent. It effectively disempowered women from making crucial decisions about their children's futures, from their education and training to their eventual marriages. A mother's love and care were certainly valued, but her legal authority and decision-making power were deemed secondary to the male-dominated structures of feudal law and inheritance. This legal subordination in guardianship rights meant that even in the most intimate sphere of family life, women lacked the ultimate legal agency that men automatically possessed. Number 3, marital consent and choice. Imagine a life where your future, your home, your partner is decided for you, not by you. This was often the reality for women in 1140 when it came to marital consent and choice. While the church increasingly emphasized the importance of mutual consent for a valid marriage, the practical and legal realities of the time, particularly for women, often meant that consent was a formality, and genuine choice was a luxury few could afford. This created a profound legal subordination, where a woman's marriage was frequently an economic or political transaction orchestrated by men, rather than an independent decision of her own heart and will. The medieval marriage was not simply about love, it was a cornerstone of social, economic, and political stability. For noble families, marriages were strategic alliances, designed to consolidate lands, forge peace treaties, or elevate social standing. Commoners, marriage often meant combining resources, labor, and ensuring the continuity of a household. In this context, individual preference, especially a woman's, was often secondary to familial and dynastic interests. Legally, the church eventually mandated that both parties must give their consent for a marriage to be valid. However, this consent could often be coerced or implied, especially for young women. Father or male guardian had enormous legal authority to arrange a marriage for his daughter or ward. While he couldn't physically force her to say, "I do," in front of a priest, as that would invalidate the sacrament, the social, economic, and emotional pressure to comply was immense. Refusal could mean disinheritance, social ostracization, or a life of poverty. There were very few legal avenues for a woman to challenge an arranged marriage her male guardian had set for her, short of literally running away to a convent, which was an extreme and often socially ruinous step. Consider the story of Lady Mathilda, a noblewoman of 14 years, whose father has arranged her marriage to a powerful lord twice her age, in order to secure a strategically important alliance against a rival family. Mathilda may feel terrified, resentful, and have no personal affection for her prospective husband. Yet when the bishop asks her, "Do you take this man as your lawful husband?" she is legally and socially compelled to say yes. If she refused, she would not only incur her father's wrath, but also risk bringing dishonor and potential ruin upon her entire family, jeopardizing their political standing and economic security. The legal weight of paternal authority, combined with societal expectations, effectively negated any genuine personal choice she might have wished to exercise. Her consent was often given under duress, a legal fiction in many cases. For women of the lower classes, the pressures were equally, if not more intense, though perhaps less about political alliance and more about economic survival. Father might arrange a marriage for his daughter to a man who owned land, or who possessed a valuable skill, to secure her future or relieve the family of her economic burden. Daughter's choice might be limited to a few available bachelors within her village, or perhaps she would be forced to marry an older widower simply for economic security. The legal system did little to protect her right to choose freely, assuming that her parents or guardians knew what was best for her. Furthermore, a woman's ability to initiate a marriage was severely restricted. She could not simply propose marriage to a man, nor could she enter into a legal contract of marriage without the explicit consent of her male guardian or father. Her marriage was a transaction, and she was often the commodity. She was given in marriage, rather than choosing to enter marriage. This fundamental difference in agency highlights the legal subordination of women in this critical life decision. What about widows? A widow generally had more autonomy in choosing a second husband, especially if she controlled her dower lands and was no longer under paternal authority. However, even then, powerful lords or the king might still exert pressure to ensure her marriage served their interests, particularly if her lands were strategically important. Choice, while greater than that of an unmarried woman, was still subject to powerful external pressures and legal obligations tied to her property. The legal and social norms of 1140 created a system where women's marital consent, while nominally required by the church, was frequently overshadowed by the legal authority of their male relatives and the overwhelming weight of familial and societal expectations. This meant that for countless women, marriage was not a union of personal choice but a predetermined path, orchestrated by men, leaving them with little to no legal agency over one of the most fundamental decisions of their lives. It was a clear manifestation of their legal subordination, stripping them of the freedom to decide their own future and their own happiness in marriage. Number 2, property ownership and inheritance. Imagine a world where your gender determined whether you could truly own property, or if your inheritance would pass to you directly, or perhaps bypass you entirely in favor of a distant male relative. This was the stark reality for women in 1140 regarding property ownership and inheritance, a domain where their legal rights were significantly subordinate to men's. The very foundations of medieval society, built on land ownership and feudal relationships, were structured in a way that systematically disadvantaged women, limiting their economic power and independence. The cornerstone of medieval inheritance law was often primogeniture, a system where the eldest legitimate son inherited all of his father's estate, title, and lands. This principle was designed to keep estates intact, maintain family power, and ensure that a single, capable male heir would fulfill feudal obligations like military service. Daughters, even if they were the eldest child, were typically excluded from this direct line of inheritance. This was not merely a social custom, it was a legally enshrined principle across much of Europe. Consider the powerful Lord Reginald, who dies leaving behind a young daughter, Lady Eleanor, and a younger nephew, a distant male relative. Under the laws of primogeniture, it was highly likely that the nephew, despite being less directly related, would inherit the barony, the castle, and all the lands, bypassing Eleanor entirely. Eleanor's future would likely be tied to a marriage alliance, where her value would be as a conduit for her future husband to gain influence or property, rather than as an independent landowner. Her legal right to inherit her father's primary estate was severely curtailed simply because she was female. She might receive a small dowry or a portion of her mother's dower, but the vast bulk of her father's wealth would be legally barred from her direct control. Even for women who were not subject to strict primogeniture, their ability to own and control property independently was complex and limited, especially if they were married. Under the legal doctrine of coverture discussed earlier, a married woman's property, both that she brought into the marriage, her dowry, and any she acquired during the marriage, legally became her husband's. He had the right to manage it, profit from it, and often sell or dispose of it without her consent. She could not, for instance, sell a piece of land she inherited without her husband's permission, nor could she legally enter into contracts concerning property. Her legal identity regarding property was absorbed into his. Imagine a married woman, Catherine, who inherited a small cottage and a plot of land from her deceased uncle. While the property might be referred to as Catherine's inheritance, her husband, Robert, would legally control it. He could decide whether to rent it out, farm it, or even sell it. If he decided to sell, Catherine's consent might be sought out of courtesy, but legally, his signature was usually sufficient to convey the property. If he squandered the proceeds, she would have little legal recourse. Her direct ownership was compromised by her marital status. The primary legal right that women had to property was through dower. Dower was the portion of her husband's property, typically 1/3, that a wife was entitled to for her support upon his death. This was a crucial right, providing widows with a degree of economic security. However, it was a right of usufruct, meaning she had the right to use and profit from the property during her lifetime, but she did not own it outright. She could not sell it, nor could she bequeath it in her will. It would revert to her deceased husband's heirs upon her own death. This was a significant limitation compared to a man's full ownership rights. Consider a widow, Lady Agnes, managing her dower lands. She could oversee the farming, collect rents from tenants, and use the income to support herself and her children. This gave her considerable practical power and autonomy. However, she could not, for instance, sell a forest on her dower land to raise capital for a new venture, because she didn't own the forest. She only had the right to its produce during her life. If she attempted to do so, her deceased husband's heirs or the feudal overlord could legally challenge her, potentially seizing the property from her. Economic independence, while greater than that of a married woman, was still circumscribed by legal definitions of ownership. Even single women or spinsters, while having more legal autonomy than married women, still faced limitations. They could inherit and own property more directly, but societal pressures often pushed them towards marriage, where their property would then fall under their husband's control. Their economic opportunities were also limited by their exclusion from guilds and many lucrative trades, making it harder to accumulate wealth independently. In summary, the legal system of 1140 deeply embedded gender disparity into property ownership and inheritance. Through primogeniture, coverture, and the limited nature of dower rights, women were systematically denied the same direct, independent control over wealth and land that men enjoy. This legal subordination profoundly affected their economic independence, their social status, and their overall power within society, making their financial well-being perpetually dependent on their relationship with a male guardian, husband, or son. Number 1. Public religious roles. Imagine living in a deeply religious society, where spiritual life permeated every aspect of existence, yet being legally barred from holding any position of authority, performing sacred rites, or interpreting holy texts in a public capacity. This was the reality for women in 1140 regarding public religious roles, a sphere where their legal subordination was absolute. While women found profound spiritual fulfillment and played crucial supportive roles within the church, the doors to official power, priesthood, and doctrinal authority were firmly and legally shut, reserved exclusively for men. The medieval Catholic Church, which was the dominant religious institution across Western Europe, adhered strictly to the legal and theological principle that women could not be ordained as priests. This exclusion was based on interpretations of biblical texts, traditional church law, canon law, and patriarchal societal norms that viewed women as unsuitable for such sacred duty. The idea that women could represent Christ at the altar, administer sacraments like the Eucharist or baptism, or hear confession, was deemed heresy and legally forbidden. This was not a matter of social preference, but a foundational legal and doctrinal stance of the Church. Consider the life of a devout and intelligent woman in 1140, perhaps someone like Hildegard of Bingen, a contemporary who, through extraordinary personal charisma and divine visions, managed to carve out a unique space of influence. Yet even Hildegard, for all her theological insights and prophetic authority, could not perform the priestly functions. She could not celebrate Mass, consecrate the host, or absolve sins. These were exclusive male prerogatives. Influence was indirect, through writing, counsel, and leadership of female communities, but it never translated into direct sacramental power. The legal barrier of gender prevented her, and all women, from holding the priestly office. This exclusion from the priesthood had far-reaching implications beyond just the altar. It meant women could not hold any significant positions of legal or administrative authority within the church hierarchy. They could not be bishops, archbishops, cardinals, or popes. Could not sit in church councils where doctrine was debated and set. Could not interpret scripture with official authority or adjudicate matters of canon law. All these roles, which carried immense spiritual, legal, and political power in medieval society, were entirely male domains. While women could, and did, dedicate their lives to God through monasticism, their roles within convents were still legally subordinate to the broader male church hierarchy. An abbess, for example, had significant authority over her nuns and the convent's property, managing large estates and sometimes wielding influence in local secular affairs. However, her authority was circumscribed. She could not ordain priests within her community, nor could she perform the sacramental duties. Her decisions were subject to the oversight of a male bishop or abbot from a male order. If a legal dispute arose involving her convent, it would typically be heard in a male-dominated ecclesiastical court. Power, though considerable within her sphere, was ultimately derived from and answerable to male religious authority. Imagine the daily life in a bustling convent. The nuns would engage in prayer, scholarship, manual labor, and perhaps charitable work. The abbess would be a formidable figure, administering vast lands and overseeing hundreds of souls. Yet when it came to spiritual guidance, the nuns would still rely on male priests to come to the convent to celebrate Mass, hear confessions, and administer sacraments. Ultimate spiritual authority and legal power within the church structure remained external and male. Even for laywomen, their participation in public religious life was largely confined to passive roles, attending Mass, receiving sacraments, participating in processions, and engaging in personal devotion. They could not preach sermons in public laid religious services, outside of perhaps some devotional singing or prayer within female groups, or teach theology with official sanction. While some mystical women might gain a following, their authority was charismatic and unofficial, always susceptible to being questioned or suppressed by the male hierarchy if it strayed too far from approved doctrine or challenged established norms. The legal and theological exclusion of women from public religious roles was a powerful and pervasive form of subordination. In a world where religion was paramount, denying women access to the most sacred and authoritative positions within the church meant denying them a vast arena of power, influence, and legal agency. It cemented the idea that spiritual authority and public leadership were inherently masculine domains, reflecting and reinforcing the broader legal and social structures that placed women in a position of perpetual subservience.